Welcome to the Emo Social Club podcast, broadcasting to you live from emosocialclub.tv. I am Brian.
And I'm Lizzie, and we're here this evening with author of the new book, Hey Suburbia, going through everything about emo and pop punk. We're with Mike Damante tonight. Thank you so much for talking with us.
Thanks so much for having me. I've done quite a few of these already and leading up to the promotion of the book, and it's so fun because it feels like I'm not doing an interview. I'm just talking about, pop punk with friends. So it's always fun. So I always love talking about this stuff. And I've written books about UFOs, so it's nice to do a podcast that's not about UFOs. It's nice to talk about punk rock and stuff. So.
Now, we've tricked you because we're only going to talk about UFOs. Now, this is an unfortunate trick. We're actually the emo UFO podcast, not... No, obviously not really. We're going to talk about pop punk. We may ask you a random question or two about UFOs near the end because Tom DeLonge and the whole we'll correlate it. We'll make it work.
It'll intertwine at a point, but not the entire way through.
But let me give you a chance to introduce yourself, talk about your background, and talk about the book and all that.
Awesome. I'm Mike Damante. I am a journalist and author and teacher based in Houston, Texas. I got my start writing basically in high school. I was on my school newspaper, and then in college, I worked for my college paper. And I started working at night at the Houston Chronicle doing copy editing, and that turned into a full-time gig, copy editing and web producing. On the side, I would write for sports and features, and we had two salaried music writers, but they wouldn't really cover this music. So I kind of volunteered myself. Hey, I already work here. I'll cover the show. I'll cover these bands. So I always consider myself the unofficial punk rock guy there, even though I wasn't the salary writer. I was just I worked on the copy desk, but I would cover Warped Tour and do all these punk rock shows and pop punk album reviews and stuff. So that's kind of my background through journalism. And so the book is something that really was years in the making, just from all my experiences covering the scene, because I did cover intensely for a very large market, very large paper too as well. So so it's basically just all these years in the making, all these experiences, all these interviews I've done, all the basically all my pop punk kid dreams came true. All the bands I was able to meet and interview and stuff. So really, I had so much of the meat of the book already kind of done, and it was just kind of piecing it all together. So that's my background, and
That's crazy to think that, especially during that time frame, that you have these music journalists on staff, and I can't even imagine what type of music they were specifically covering. I mean, in Houston, Texas, I'm assuming country for the most part, but to not include such a big chunk of what's on that on the radio during that era is insane to me.
So let me rewind it a little bit. So during the 99s and 2000s, early 2000s, I was still in college. So I was graduated high school in 2000. So I was still kind of early on in college. I really didn't start doing this up until probably 2003 for the University of Houston paper. And so how it works in college when you're majoring in journalism, they give you a beat, and it's not something you want to write about. But in addition to that, you can do whatever you want. So I was writing about 10 stories a week on my technology beat. I was doing album reviews, covering whatever I could. And then basically I was writing the life and art section, 90% of it myself, because a lot of times at the time, the labels are really marketing towards that college audience. So we were really able to get free tickets, free shows, free merch. They sent all this stuff in to kind of entice you to cover them. And I remember I had a lot of great opportunities doing Warped Tour. I did that in college. My favorite interview of all time, getting to hang out with Tom DeLonge backstage at Angels and Airwaves and Weezer. That was for the college paper. And eventually I was able to do that again, kind of for the Chronicle as well. But so I had so many opportunities then. And then kind of when I went, when I started working at the Chronicle around that time, I mean, the music was still popular. It's a little bit past the boom, but none of these bands really, died out in terms of popularity, just because radio and MTV weren't playing them, which at the time radio and MTV was kind of dying down too as the internet was growing. So just in general, I remember, I think the first thing I covered for them was Newfound Glory. And then I think the biggest thing I did at the Chronicle in terms of for this scene, I remember when Blink did their reunion tour, I interviewed them, and it was the front page story on the entertainment section. So they did realize that there's an audience for this music. Just, the two other beat writers we had, one of them was doing like hip hop and pop. The other one was more like indie rock stuff. So there was an audience for it for sure. And I did cover it, the best, whenever I could. But so many opportunities, Warped Tour, so many, I covered X Games when in Austin. I covered the year when it was Kanye West and Bad Religion and Waves, and then when it was Blink and All Time Low. So like those are some of the greatest experiences I've had in my life, not just professionally, but like personally, just really good times doing it. And to me, it never really felt like work. The opportunity to interview, I have to drive up to Austin. I get to interview Blink backstage for free. Sure. Or I get to drive up to Austin to interview Milo Ackerman from The Descendants. Like that's like a bucket list thing, like I wasn't getting paid any extra money because I was already working there. So for me, it was like, basically I'm getting paid with getting into the show for free and able to interview these bands that I grew up, worshiping.
They don't do it like they used to, honestly.
Yeah.
I mean, when I was running my college radio station, it was like we got some of those, but it was like pulling teeth at a certain point to get those bigger names. So to kind of understand how that kind of like has evolved is like insane to me.
Yeah. It was a different time, I think, in the early, I'm trying to think when I was at U of H. I think it was like 2006. So it was a kind of a different time then, I guess, in terms of the music industry. But I just remember, it wasn't just music, it was movies too. Like movie studios would send us stuff, and, we would get books, from authors and stuff. So yeah, I think it was a different time then as it was nowadays. I think the marketing budgets are a little bit different. The money's allocated differently now.
Yeah, they're like, we don't want these children here. Get them out of here.
I mean, I imagine it's like with media changing, they're probably pushing it more to like online resources and those kinds of things, more influencer marketing, maybe things like that, rather than that. I remember in high school, I hung out with all my friends on newspaper, and they would always have like, remember specifically like the newest Kanye West CD, whatever year it was. I forget. I don't know many Kanye West records by name, but I remember they got like a copy of it, and we were just like hanging in there, and it's like, yeah, we just get free CDs all the time. You want one? I'm like, yeah, it sounds great. Like, how perfect. I don't even have to be on the newspaper. I just get to hang out in your office and listen to free CDs you get. I imagine they're not like reaching out to school newspapers as much for Kanye West promotion anymore.
I think the amount of like, because I got asked this by a band. They were like, oh, if we want to send to like college radio stations, do we send a physical CD anymore? And I'm like, no, it's a digital, because at least at my college radio station, what we did with the CDs that we didn't like, which was a lot of them, is we put them on the wall and glued it and made it aesthetically pleasing. And I'm like, well, that's what's going to happen. You could be aesthetically pleasing, but no one might listen to it. So it depends on the vibe you're trying to go for in the end.
So obviously taking all that information, and then now I guess you've turned it into do we say like the most comprehensive history of pop punk? Should we say that? Are we allowed to say that?
I wouldn't even say that. Like I said, I wrote it as a guide. You basically get an overview of the history and the scene and the roots of it too. And that's really one thing I really wanted to connect was to the roots, because I think it's important for new people who are getting into the style of music to pick it up and, look back and see the bands that influenced the bands, because it really is, I always talk about punk rock as one umbrella, and there's all these subgenres that hang from it. And you really can draw the lineage. And one of the greatest quotes in the book was from Milo Ackerman from The Descendants. And he said, it was basically, they never felt territorial about it. You know what I mean? Like when Green Day and Blink was coming up, because to him, it was the Buzzcocks and Ramones, then the Descendants, and then Green Day and Blink. So it's like he understands the lineage. So I think that's really cool that, a lot of the bands understand how it kind of worked, the evolution. And that's one of the things, like I really wanted to put home in the book, because there is a nostalgia element to it for people like us who kind of grew up with the stuff. But then there's newer kids who are getting into this stuff now because maybe their parents or their older brother listens to it, or, or they, Will Smith has a pop punk song, or they like Machine Gun Kelly or whatever. So I think that was a really important part of the book, is to kind of give you an overview. I wouldn't say it's the most comprehensive. That's why I kind of did it in a coffee table format. So it's really digestible. It's something you pick up and read and just kind of learn something while you're sitting on the toilet or waiting for, waiting for your friend to cook dinner or something.
I love that.
I think it's interesting too because you have it, and then you are talking about like these more legendary bands, like the Descendants, and I want to know what your perspective from like people who are like big like emo purists, like those who are like I only consider Rites of Springs like real emo, those types of people, like looking at it and then seeing this like not like glamorized but just put on a public display to say hey, this is what it is because this is what's mainstream, this is what's popular again, and this is what the kids kind of like now. Have you had any like negative reception from those types of individuals at all, especially because you have Chris Carrabba from Dashboard in there too? So I'm like, I feel like that's one of the bigger key players that people like to reference, that's like an easier person to pick out for like the newer generation, like people in my age range and like in like our 20s.
Yeah, for sure. Not yet. I mean, I'm sure that will happen. Like, I have some friends like who are like emo purists, right? I remember I DJ'd an emo night once, guest DJ'd it, and he came and he was just like ripping into the songs that we were playing. And it's like, I'm sorry, but it's like these kids don't know who who American Football is or The Promise Ring, So it's like they want to hear the Used and My Chemical Romance and stuff like that. But it is really like like you said, it's really. There was a time where, like the gatekeepers, right? What's emo, what isn't? But God, it's the umbrella is just so big. And, it's hard. How can you tell somebody, listen to Jimmy World and Take It Back Sunday and say that that's not emo, and then listen to an older band like the Promise Ring or, the Get Up Kids. And, some of the first, when I first started getting in this music, and this was years ago. So just to give you guys some background, I'm originally from New York, and we're moving from New York to Texas. In between, I lived in Pennsylvania for about a year. I had no friends except for this one guy. We would watch wrestling, play Dungeons and Dragons, like nerd stuff together.
Oh, yeah.
And I remember when I moved, he gave me some CDs, and it was Juliana Theory, Get Up Kids, older emo bands, and Cheshire Cat by Blink. And I listened to all of them, and there's something about it that kind of like put a spark in my head. There was this energy to it, and I didn't know what to make of it. It was one of those things. And I'm older. I'm a 90s kid. So, growing up in the 90s, then you start hearing that stuff in alternative rock radio. You start hearing Offspring, Green Day, Blink. First time I heard Dude Ranch, I'm like, oh my God, this is the guys from that Cheshire Cat CD. And then my mind was blown, So, yeah, but, if you look at that era, you also had No Doubt and Mighty Mighty Boss Tones, and all these bands were crossing over. And then you kind of see in the 2000s happening with the emo bands, with Jimmy World and Saves the Day and Taking Back Sunday and Dashboard Confessional too.
I'm glad that we're talking about some 90s stuff too, because I'm usually the old one, and everybody's like, yeah, I really like all these bands. And I'm like, yeah, I was old.
Not today. I'm the old one today. So
yeah, I mean, yes. And not to put you out there, I'm just like, yeah, thank you. Thank you for being old with me a little bit.
Oh my God.
Bye. Emo night wise, like what are your, so I mean, I've done one here too. We obviously are an emo podcast, and I think that our primary focus has been on a lot of the early 2000s, the My Chems, the Used, Fall Out Boy, Panic, and it's like we know that that's what it is now, and I feel like there's been this pretty long conversation about how that's what it is. Like there is this argument, but it's like it's a very vocal minority of people who understand that like the term has gone away from what it probably originally meant, and now it means something else, and it means this to a large amount of people, and we just kind of have to accept it. Like that's just what it's been accepted as. But the emo night side of it, and like doing events, and then having like cover bands, and I'm sorry if I said that with any attitude. I had one, and I'm like the whole thing, and like doing DJ sets and all that. Like, does it feel like that is still? I guess it's something that could be gate kept, but I start to feel like it's one of the reasons why a lot of people have started to get into it more, going into this new decade. Like feels like in the past couple of years, it's been like this resurgence of it, the new pop punk wave, the new emo wave, all that. Like I feel like that's kind of the reason we got to it, and like all this gatekeeping and all this nonsense like didn't really hinder that. So like, do you feel like that's where a lot of this comes from, is all those nostalgia things, or or yeah.
Yeah, to a degree. I think, having those emo nights, just to introduce new people to it, but also having, older people relive those days. And I mean, for me, it's the best way to describe it. I tell people it's like the Warped Tour generation. Like the book is about the Warped Tour generation because so many of those bands, the emo bands, punk rock bands, pop punk bands, ska bands, metalcore bands, hardcore bands, they're all under that, post-hardcore bands are all under that umbrella, those subgenres of punk. And Warped Tour really kind of brought that together. So, I know people just like to, put tags and genres on things, but I think kids nowadays really care less about genre. In general, they just kind of like to have fun, and they may perceive emo as something different than we did, but as long as they understand the roots and like the bands, you know what I mean? Like, because, there was a time when South Park even did an episode of it when it was like everyone thought the emo kids were goth and vice versa. Yeah. So it's like, it really has become this cultural thing.
Yeah. Oh, I remember that. I was so upset. Like, I was already not really a huge fan of South Park, and then I was like, okay, why are you attacking me? I don't even watch your show. So upset.
And I want to know though, because there's so much like basis, obviously, that we're going through in this book. But then you do like talk about MGK and like these newer artists that are coming out. Who are some of like your personal favorite newer like emo pop punk acts that have been coming out recently?
I was talking about this earlier. Like, I really wanted to mention in the book like some of these newer acts because I feel like obviously, you have the mainstream artists like Post Malone, Machine Gun Kelly, Will Smith, who are kind of doing these songs now. So there are obviously spotlights on them. And there really hasn't been a band from the scene that's broke really since All Time Low in terms of like mainstream. I think Wonder Years was like on the cusp of it, but they're big and they're, in a smaller setting, I guess, if that makes sense. But for me, I look back and I'm like, man, there's tons of great bands and still making this music that aren't major label or aren't, necessarily, getting radio play, because a lot of these, like I said, all these pop artists are kind of co-opting the sound in a way. But as far as newer bands, I would say, past few years, Touche Amore, I'm really into. They're a really great hardcore band. I listened to a band a couple weeks ago, Action Adventure. They were great.
Oh yeah, those are our buddies.
Yeah.
I was gonna say, I saw they follow you guys on Twitter. I was like, I wonder if they know each other.
Yeah. We did a guest DJ night with them, so they're super cool dudes.
Yeah.
And then there's a band called Talk Show Host out of Canada, really good. Really reminds me of like the Vagrant Records sound. So those are some of like the newer bands that I like. What else? I'm trying to think. A band called Salem, which is really cool. It's the guy from Creeper.
Oh my God, I love Salem. I love Creeper.
I never listened to Creeper ever, but I heard Salem. I'm like, man, this is like Ackline Trio. I love it.
It's so. Did you listen to their newest EP?
Yeah.
Yeah. It just hits. I don't know. It just keeps going. They know what we want.
Yeah.
That dark pop.
I mean, listening to that, and I'm like, I could totally picture Matt Skiba singing or writing this. But yeah, no, those are some like the newer bands I've heard that I've liked. Like many older people, I just kind of like listen to like the older stuff, but I do know a lot of the newer bands coming out, and I still do like this little fun blog on the side for the Chronicle. It's called Mic'd, and I usually try to review like newer, smaller artists like that, like Talk Show Host and what are some of the other ones? I'm trying. Who else? Jetty Bones.
Oh, Jetty Bones is really good.
Jetty Bones is good. Hot Mulligan is good. There's a lot of them. There's a lot of really rad new bands that are really bringing back kind of those, those days of the early 2000s for sure.
I kind of think I've been stewing on this for a while, Lizzie. I've been stewing on this, and I'm like, is this one of the best times in music in a long, like in I don't want to say ever. I feel like that's really hard if you haven't lived through a lot of different situations and looking at like.
That's a really strong statement.
It's a very strong situation
compared to like everything. Like, that's a real spicy take there.
If your musical education like mine was watching VH1 and MTV and like watching like docs on Motley Crue, and it's like, well, I don't know what the 80s were like. I was like 15 watching docs on Motley Crue. It's like I can't even comprehend what they were doing at the time. I can't comprehend what the 80s looked like to a full-grown adult, doing cocaine or whatever. But or whatever. But like is it possible? Because it just feels like music right now is at the most like there are no genres, there are no like barriers. There are more people that look different. There are more people that don't look just like me doing it, you know, and like it brings in all these other genres. It brings in all these other types of people into what overall has been pretty homogenous and like creating like a new sense of music. So like to me, that kind of builds to like where I'm thinking, is this one of the best times for music overall?
I don't
agree. You don't have to agree.
It's because, like, you know, it's hard because I look at 1997 to, I would say 2004 as like being the golden age for me personally. I guess the 90s in general, I think is the greatest era of music. Like the hip hop was great, the alternative rock was great. Punk broke twice during that time in 94, then again in 99. Then that birthed the early 2000s, which kind of gave us, you know, the Warped Tour generation that, you know, went from the skate parks to the mall to everywhere. So it's like, to me, that's really the golden age of music for me personally, just because, like I said, you know, 97 was, God, my favorite record of all time came out that year, Dude Ranch. And, you know, all those alternative rock bands and like the punk bands were getting played side by side on the radio. And it all sounded like it worked next to each other. Nothing sounded out of place. And like I said, next thing you know, 3 years later, it's blowing up even more where, you know, Good Charlotte's on TRL and, you know, some 41s and like teen magazines. So it's just crazy to think that it exploded like that again. But
yeah,
it's more than just like the music, but it was really, you know, you felt like you're a part of something. And that's when you're part of, you know, a music scene or just a scene in general. I think that's why so many kids kind of gravitated towards it, because in the book, I kind of discuss various things that were going on in the world around that time that maybe influenced that too. But even to this day, you know, like, you know, when you go to those shows and see those bands, you know, it really hasn't feel like, you know, much has changed. You know, it kind of transports you back to that time and era. And it was really a special place for those people who grew up in that era, or for those people who didn't grow up in that era but like the music from that era. It's definitely a special time.
I agree with that. Lizzie, what do you think was the best era of music?
I think the era where I was a whole ass child, so the one that Mike just described.
Fair.
I was born at the end of 94. I was like a baby.
So you were born when Green Day broke. There you go. You and Green Day.
I'm like almost 95. I'm that close to the border.
Yeah.
So I was just hardly there. But I think during all that, because I'm like, this is like the music I love. Fall Out Boy is my favorite band. I love My Chemical Romance. I was able to see them in LA. Like, but I also love the Jonas Brothers. So like I have this weird melding with people with a lot of different music that I personally have listened to. And it's like, oh, I do listen to a lot of this music, and people are like, you're not old enough to have like lived it. I'm like, okay, but I want to feel like I did and understand it a little bit. Let me have it.
Yeah. And that's great. I think that's part of, I think, what makes, you know, the emo nights and, you know, podcasts like this. And I think it makes it special because you're opening up that community again to, you know, to like newer people. And yeah, I think that's great. You know, there's obviously the gatekeeper part of it where you're like, oh, Post Malone and Halsey, whatever, they're co-opting this music. But then there's also, oh, well, you know, if a kid discovers Newfound Glory because of that, or you know, listens to a Blink record, or, you know, saves the day, well, then cool, you know, mission accomplished. Or, you know, somebody listens to Hayley Williams and they didn't know she was in Paramore, then they listen to Paramore. So it's really, you know, it kind of goes back to, you know, the early days of like punk rock and pop punk. There was definitely that attitude about bands being on the radio, selling out, which no one talks about that anymore. That doesn't really exist nowadays. But back then there was that attitude too. But it was ultimately, you know, it helped the community grow as a whole. You know, when you'll get Epitaph Records, they became one of the largest independent records, and Offspring became a major label band. Well, guess what? All those other bands then benefited from that on the label, Bad Religion, Rancid, etc. So it's like, it was really back then, you know, when their peers were getting bigger than some of the bands, everyone really benefited from it. And that's kind of grew that community. So like a lot of people who were, you know, you hear the sellout arguments, that was mostly just coming from like magazines and like kids on message boards, because it was never really like that with the bands. There was always camaraderie and you respect even the bands that kind of, you know, surpassed some of the other bands. You know, you never heard them really legit talk bad about each other. It was mostly, you know, good and So there's definitely that punk rock sense of community. And I think, it's nice nowadays that you really don't see that, oh, this band's a sellout or any of that talk anymore.
I'm interested to hear what your perspective is, because this has been like a really widely debated topic this last year since MGK came out with Tickets to My Downfall. Do you think that he and Travis Barker, obviously, because he's single-handedly leading this, I feel, in a way, is that the true reintroduction of pop punk to this current mainstream, to this new Gen Z era? Or do you think it would be another artist or band that has championed it more?
Well, it's hard because kids nowadays like My Chemical Romance. Their reunion tour sold out in like 45 minutes. That's insane. Like the whole world, like that's almost unheard of nowadays. Like Taylor Swift and Drake don't do that. You know what I mean? So like that says something. Kids like Paramore nowadays, like kids like, to them, classic rock to them is like Blink and Green Day. So it's like they're familiar with they're familiar with these bands. They already know who they are. But I think having, like artists like Machine Gun Kelly, kind of like Tickets to My Downfall is a great record, no matter what you feel about Machine Gun Kelly. But apparently he does have a pop punk background. Like Blink was his favorite band. And it's like when I first heard that record and I saw Travis produced it, I was like, man, all these production tricks and songwriting tricks that Travis is doing, I wish you'd bring some of those to Blink songs.
Yeah.
Some of his songs sound like Blink, but if you look at it, he worked with so many different artists, and it could definitely be, if you work with a hip hop artist, and a hip hop artist listens to, Blink or some of these other bands, and say, oh, you know what, this is actually pretty cool. Hey, let's do a song like that. So I think it's really, part of it's his influence, and he's a very sought after drummer and producer. But the people he's working with are like, hey, let's do a song that sounds like this, and then more, like a lot of people believe that, Travis's record label are bringing it back to the mainstream, and that's an argument. I can see that side of the argument for sure.
I think so too. Like you had mentioned, just rap and hip hop. So Kenny Hoopla is another artist. Yeah. He's like that. And Travis just did his entire his newest mixtape EP with him. And I'm like, this is it. This is, first of all, this is what I think Blink-182 should have been. It sounded like, I listened to it. I said, this is what Blink-182 should be right now. And it's not. And Travis said, I'm going to do it for this kid because he has talent. He has everything ahead of him. And I think with that too, it just opens up so much more, because I know that even my younger siblings, they're really into Juice WRLD, and I didn't get into him until Come and Go came out, and then I started listening more, and then obviously because of the whole Yellow Card suing Juice WRLD and his estate, that whole mess, I'm like, let me see what this really sounds like. And I heard everything. I'm like, okay, I get it. I understand this crossover that's happening, and it's becoming so much more popular, and it's just so cool to see, like you said, there's just genre blending at this point. And most people who like to, listen to new music and take in that kind of information are really cool with it. And I think that's just so good for the ecosystem of music in general, just to bring in something fresh and new in that retrospect.
And culturally, it's not that different, when you think about it. I was thinking earlier, one of the things I mentioned in the book is how skate culture went hand in hand with pop punk and punk rock for years. I mean, for Warped Tour, X Games, Tony Hawk soundtracks, but the kids would go to the shows were dressed up like little skater kids, And back in the day, Pac Sun was, Hurley and Volcom and Vans. Nowadays, Pac Sun is Hundreds and, Nike, but it's the hip hop culture is skate culture, just as punk rock culture is skate culture. So there's a lot of intermingling with these cultures to this day still.
I went into Hot Topic recently, and I was very disappointed. I went into Hot Topic, and I was very disappointed. I went into Zoomies, and I was very surprised. And I was like, wait, Zoomies is now selling the clothes that I want to wear, whatever that is. I'm old, and I'm not going to wear children's weird dark clothing, but I did.
What, you don't want your trip pants back?
I don't want trip pants back.
Okay, that's really upsetting for you. I'm sorry that you're at that time in your life.
Look, I stand by this. I will say I did buy an anime T-shirt at.
Of course you did.
At Zoomies, because I like anime and I like wearing anime T-shirts. But it's true. It's now I think that with everything else is the fashion and the interests and the things that people are passionate about are kind of evolving too. And the fact that, people are getting interested in other things and then kind of bringing that back into the music side of it. And then the music is growing because of that. And then it's bringing more into those cultures. It's like, yeah, it's very like it's a melting pot, I guess, for lack of a better metaphor. Not my favorite metaphor, but I'll use it for this one, I guess. It's like kind of that melting pot of like everything coming together, all culture, all media, like kind of swirling around and creating this new pop punk emo thing and hip hop and everything else, I guess.
Yeah, that works.
Yeah.
It works. It tracks to an extent. I mean, like reading the section that you have in the book called New Americana, where you kind of compare and contrast like R&B and blues to like emo and pop punk with like a lot of the different like themes. I'm like, I've never really thought about that. I think that was just like a really interesting thing to point out, because I know a lot of people, like myself included, I don't listen to too much of that type of older music, but I can definitely hear and understand. And like, if I looked up to lyrics to any song, I'd be like, oh yeah, that's like, it's pretty fucking sad.
Well, like, yeah, thank you for that, by the way. Thank you for appreciating that part of the book. But for me, you know, listening to like a band like Taking Back Sunday, like progressed through the years, and like you hear them like, man, this is, and like Jimmy Eat World, they just sound like good American rock bands. Where like, you know, if this was like the '80s, I think they'd be opening for like Springsteen back then. You know what I mean? And like, you look at a band like the Gaslight Anthem, who did get to open for Springsteen as well. So yeah, to me, it's like there's really a lot of parallels between this, you know, this music and the music that's been being made for the longest time. You know, the emo music and pop punk music, it's really not too different in terms of content. I just think there's an authenticity to it that makes it special.
It really reminded me, there was this, I think it was through Gimlet on Spotify. They did this special little series called Murder Bellas, and it actually was one of the newer like Spotify radio shows when they first came out with it. And one of them that stood out was like looking at all these ballads that originated in like the 1800s, specifically in like the Wild Wild West, basically. And they looked at the one song in the Pines that Kurt Cobain covered from Nirvana, and they played like the original one of an older recording, and then they played the Nirvana version, and it's like, okay, we can hear like these different things going on. It's like, obviously it's a very sad, very devastating story, and then you also hear it told in a newer way. And they also had other country artists who were on there who did their own interpretations of it. And I'm like, okay, that's also another way to like see it all across the board, because I think also in like 20 to 50 years, what if, you know, obviously people do covers of all these songs now, like what if somebody was like, oh, I'm going to do my own interpretation of like Helena by My Chemical Romance, and it's something like completely wild and different, like say a completely different genre. And then we're like, oh yeah, like that sounds cool. I vibe with that. I get it. It makes sense to my ears, even though like usually wouldn't. I just think that that's such a cool like divergence.
Yeah, I think that's the mark of good songwriting, where it could be covered in different ways. Like you look at like, you know, Woody Guthrie, like This Land Is Your Land. It sounds like a punk, like Anti-Flag has covered it. But it's like, you look at the lyrics, that sounds like a punk rock song. It really does. There's a protest element to it. But yeah, like, you know, you were saying, like, there's guys like Alex Melton. I don't know if you guys ever listened to his stuff. Yeah, like, and he crushes it on these country covers, and or, you know, if this band wrote it to sound like this. And we're just hearing like ukulele versions or like, what is it? Mariachi versions of like these songs. It's great. And that's a mark of a good songwriter. Like, I also like, you know, other music outside of this. Like I love Taylor Swift, and I listened to Taylor Swift song, and I was like, man, if this song was covered to be like a punk rock song, it'd be so rad. But that's just like a good mark of like good songwriting. And I think that speaks volumes to the songwriting and emo and pop punk. The fact that, you know, like you said, someone can cover Helena 5 years from now, make an electronic song or a country folk song is still as good. I think that's, you know, that's just a mark of good songwriting.
Fucking love Taylor Swift. Do you think like with that, like, because obviously Alex Melton does like the country covers, and I think for us, I mean, we're in Chicago and country is not a huge thing here, I guess. I mean, I know it's a huge genre. It does numbers and there are people that really like it. But in Chicago, it's obviously like, you know, there's a stigma. speaking to you from Houston, and I'm sure that there's like way more country
It's
bars.
more folk. It's more folk up here.
Yeah.
They're like, no. I am not yeehaw. I am folk. It's like, all right, let's bring it back.
I've been to multiple bars where they only have like country bands play. Like my friends have worked there and all that, and I'm like, okay, well, this is a yeehaw good time right here. And like in Chicago, it's like that's how we kind of feel about it. But then him taking all these emo songs and making them country, I think for us in Chicago, we're kind of just like, yeah, that's goofy. Like no one really, like whatever. You're not really gonna do that, right? It's just like a joke. Yeah, it's goofy. But like, is there that inroad for country in? I guess now we're going to talk about a Data Remembers record, but it's like bringing in that country influence too, with all the other influences that have come in. Like for us here, I don't think that we've really seen a lot of country influence in the same way we've seen everything else.
Well, I mean, like in terms of like pop punk and punk rock, there's kind of like some of the rockabilly elements and a lot of the bands who incorporated like folk and stuff. So I think, you kind of strip down, what does punk rock mean? What is it supposed to sound like? But, there's so many different artists who really, conventionally don't do that. Even like the early punk rock bands, like The Clash and The Damned, they were experimenting from the start. Then you have artists like Frank Turner, who has a punk rock background, who plays this really upbeat, catchy folk music, and then you have, you have like Joey Cape from Lagwagon, whose solo stuff is very folk and acoustic-y. So yeah, I think there's definitely different sides to these artists, and like some of like the really good punk songs sound great acoustically, So I think there's definitely an audience for for folk and this style of music and any type of crossovers for sure.
Would you rather hear more country influences or more butt rock influences? Because I feel like you can go either way.
Probably country, I guess. I don't know. Like, see, like the thing is, I live in Houston, but Houston's such a big city. It's like hip hop is huge here.
Yeah.
Like country is like big in Texas, I guess, but it's not like, I don't know, like hip hop is like the thing in Houston for sure.
Gotcha. I mean, I'm a big butt rock fan. I don't know if I wanted that on recording. I'm sorry that is now.
You made that statement all on your own. You provoked your own self.
The opinions and things said by me are the opinions and things said by me. That's the only person saying it. But you
have to be the adult in this situation, and you are.
I have heard a lot of people slandering nu metal lately, and I will not stand for it because I think that it is bad on purpose, and that's why you love it. And butt rock.
Dude, I went back in and I listened to the Korn "Follow the Leader" like a few months ago for the first time in forever, and I was like, man, this album is like still great.
Yeah. Look, there's some good stuff there. Like Limp Bizkit's playing festivals this summer. There's obviously a market for it. They're trying to bring back nu metal. They're trying to bring back everything else. And like thinking like the country side of it is like for us, Lizzie, Octane Radio. It's like, you got like all the butt rock bands that are appealing like to the same kind of people, the same kind of markets. So you're like, yeah, you got to go like A Day to Remember, and you end up being more like country. You go like, I guess, Asking Alexandria, and you end up more butt rock. Nothing but rock.
Oh God.
I don't know. There's got to be Alex Melton has to get on the butt rock cover train now.
I think it's really just you trying to bring back butt rock like a little bit too hard. Like I heard when I was listening to Octane Radio this afternoon on my drive, I turned it on. I heard the classic violins. You hear any good old Skillet song, and I said, "They're great. That is still trucking and still happening." Even though everything they've done and said this past year, besides the point. But how do you feel? I know on TikTok there has been a huge trend right now going with Flyleafs all around me. People just discovering Flyleaf and then figuring out that they're Christian rock and then finding out more about Flyleaf and the whole Lacey Sturm thing. How do you feel like there's going to be any type of like second wave of like Christian rock coming back with this new wave of like pop punk in the mainstream?
Well, I had no idea that was a thing. Flyleaf, I didn't even know Flyleaf was a Christian band, nor was it TikTok.
They were heavily
thing. I remember though finding like Tooth and Nail back in the day was like a Christian label, I think, and no one really knew about that. And like you had bands like Reliant K and MXPX, and a lot of times it wasn't really overt in their lyrics. I think in MXPX Today's Another Day says something like "God is great" or something. But it was cool because you could see MXPX play alongside Bad Religion, and everything was cool.
Mm.
You know, you did see a little bit division, a culture clash, kind of like, and I mentioned this in the book when I talk about Warped Tour, when you have like Fat Mike from NoFX like bullying, like, or joking around with like Under Oath.
Yeah.
And some of those other bands. And there's a great thing, I think I mentioned it too in the book. Fuse did this like Warped Tour like documentary series, and they had a Bible study.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like, so many of these bands you didn't think were Christian, and Fat Mike from NoFX shows up and just to kind of ask questions. And I think he was surprised because some of these like, not wussier bands, but some of these like, softer pop punk bands came up to him and said, "Hey man, like NoFX is the reason why we play music." So I think that really kind of shows the coming together too. Like, hey, yeah, this generational divide between these old punkers and these new kids who are, Christian and writing, safer music, but there's obviously, still a common ground and, as well. So I think that's fascinating too.
Remember that being such a rough time, like hearing all the reports from Warped Tour, like AP Magazine and all that covering it, like, yeah, there's like this big beef between Under Oath and Fat Mike, and then Under Oath, like, I think that was right before they ended up going on hiatus, and then they came back and were like, yeah, we're really not like the same kind of Christian band. Like, we've all had our different experiences since the band broke up and like went all these different ways. And I'm like, damn it, NoFX, look what you did.
Well, I think that's just, Fat Mike's always been like a ball buster, even like he's always been friends with like Sum 41, but he always kind of make jokes with them. And in their book, they were a little, when Blink made it big, they were a little kind of not jealous, but they were friends with them, but they're like, man, this band sounds just like us, and they make jokes just like us, and how come we're not as big? But NoFX is not making a lot of money anyway. Fat Mike, with the Fat Records and everything. So I think it's partly him. I think nowadays you wouldn't see that as much. That playful ribbing of bands. Yeah, I think you wouldn't see that nowadays. But looking back, I mean, it was really interesting times on those Warped Tours. Having NoFX, Under Oath, and some of those other bands just kind of having Guttermouth and having these all really offensive punk rock bands playing next to these kids who just discovered the style of music, probably 5 or 6 years prior to playing the shows.
I think if you said it now, it would just like trigger a bunch of like discourse on the internet. I feel the only other band that I've seen do it, and it's gone like pretty well because they're just so like just talking out of their ass because they're so funny, is like Heart Attack Man and Hot Mulligan. Like they kind of go back and forth. Like every time I see them tweet, I'm like, all right, I get it. And then when I see Water Parks also do kind of the similar thing, but they just do it in all caps, and then it just makes me noise. Like, please do it in normal lettering. Do not do it in all caps. You are not Jimmy. You're in a mindless self-indulgence. Please step back and reevaluate yourself, my guy.
I mean, I think in general, there's a camaraderie amongst kind of these bands, and Warped Tour really kind of brought that together for a while, even though there was kind of generational divides. And one of the things I did cover in the book too is, Warped Tour wasn't perfect. They made mistakes with some of the people they booked. And it's one of the reasons why I wanted to, get Warren Women, interview them, because they were a feminist punk rock band who was basically in response to them booking Front Porch, what was that guy's name? Front Step Porch, whatever his name was. And
the creepy guy.
Yeah, and some of these metalcore bands that like really didn't get it, like they didn't understand the scene and the tour, and basically just rock stars, these rock star attitudes, and they're basically on the wrong tour, in my opinion.
Yeah. I'm really glad that that's changing in the culture.
Yeah,
I'm really glad.
I think it's great that kids nowadays are just kind of more woke to this stuff, and bands are too. So I think that's really cool that it's a safer place for kids to go to shows, and for everyone to go to shows too, which is really cool because ultimately, this type of music is all inclusive anyway.
Mm.
And you're seeing,
Go ahead. No, you go ahead.
You're seeing,
I mean, there's so many more bands now that you see more representation and diversity. We Are the Union is a ska band that has, people of color and trans people. And so it's really cool that you're seeing, I think that really started with, Laura Jane Grace, from Against Me, when she kind of came out, and that's really snowballed and as well. So I think, you're seeing a lot more inclusion and representation too.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
There was always a thing like with pop punk. I remember like showing some of my friends who like weren't super familiar with the genre when I was an undergrad, and I'm like, this is a really inclusive scene, and like compared to like, you know, the indie rock scene where I feel like they're a little bit more like, I knew this band before you, and like they really push it. But in pop punk, it's like, oh no, it's just for everybody. Like it doesn't matter if you just know the bangers. Like if you just know the bangers, that's cool. People are still going to be cool with you and like show you new music if you're into it and just accept it. But you know, when you talk about it, then you actually see, you're like, well, they're just like a bunch of white dudes from the suburbs who hate their mom. They just yell at them all the time. That's
How
not really
dare you,
inclusive,
Lizzie.
but now I see now in the last like 5 or so years, like it's opening up so much more substantially. And I think, you know, being able to one highlight in the book and then also just have it consistently tracking in the mainstream right now. It's just such a good like collision to finally see it actually happening and like actually resonating with what the kind of overall like unspoken ethos of like pop punk kind of is.
And I think a lot of these bands are just, you know, they're younger bands who are influenced by that music. Now they're, you know, they're making music, and you're seeing kind of more of that nowadays in general. And I think it's great that you're seeing more younger bands kind of gravitate towards picking up a guitar as opposed to, you know, Pro Tools.
I was that
Not
kid
everyone
who
can
was
be Skrillex.
Yeah, I wanted to be. Like I was like right around the time where I was like, I'm gonna be in a band, I'm gonna sing for a band, and we're gonna be like this. And then it was like, I want to say like 2009, 2010, where it's like all of a sudden EDM starts picking up, and I'm like, I'll learn how to produce. Like I'll do some dubstep, and I started like learning how to do that. But I was like still in a metal band, so I'm like, I'll just do this combined, and it was. I'm gonna say it. I think I was ahead of my time, and no one else thought that because we were just an Enter Shikari ripoff, and we broke up soon after. So, you know,
hey, Enter Shikari is. I think that's a band that's like ahead of their time. Like first time I heard them, I'm like, man, like when you hear the pitch, like, oh, this is gonna sound awful, but they make it work. They really do. And like their new stuff is just so atmospheric, and like it sounds like you're watching the soundtrack to like Black Mirror. Like that's what I feel when I listen to that band. No, like when I heard them years ago, I think when I was in college, I think, and I was like, this should not work. I should hate this. You know, it works, and it's actually really good.
Yep.
The way they mix like arena rock, you know, dance music, hardcore, and like punk, and it works.
Yep. I couldn't have said it better myself. I'm like, yeah, this works so well. They're one of my favorite bands, so I'm happy to talk a lot about it. But then I'm like, I listen to like Bring Me the Horizon now, and I'm like, this is what I wanted to do in 2012, and couldn't do it. Nobody wanted me to do it. People were like, we played a show once, and they like, so you have to have tracks behind you. You have to have like the music playing, like all the electronic parts behind you, because we're not playing fucking weird synths on stage, right? And we were playing this metal show, so like we're the only band that has synths in our shit, and like, of course, everybody in the venue is like these metal purists, which is just awful to be around. And they're like, yeah, they definitely had like all the music tracked, like they weren't actually doing anything real on stage. Meanwhile, like both of our guitarists brought like 2 half stacks, so it's like, why would we bring all this shit just to like not play any of it? And they gave us like, it was like a competition to play South by Southwest, and we ended up getting last place. And I was like,
oh my god,
fantastic. That was one of the worst times of it. I want to ask, because obviously you released this as a book, and a lot of like the content that I'm receiving about like the history is primarily from YouTube. Was there like a conscious effort to go more of the book route rather than doing like another media route, I guess? Is there a reason that you did it that way? Even as a journalist, I know obviously as a writer is probably your strong point, but was there another reason like you went with the book side of it?
Yeah, as a writer and a journalist, you know, writing is my strong point. I don't feel like, you know, I can do video, but I don't feel like having to build that audience again. And I just, you know, I'm old school. I like having something physical in front of me, you know, and I really thought it'd be a great way, because like when I first started writing the book, it really took different direction before it ended up being a coffee table book in terms of, you know, what it's going to look like, how this is going to, you know, how am I going to tell this story? How am I going to, you know, incorporate elements to it that make it, you know, easily digestible. So it really was going to be a book all along. And, there's many people in the scene who, have been covering this music as well. Scott Heisel, I got him in the book too. He should write a book about this stuff one day. Dan Osley has a book coming out in October called Sellouts, which is about the major label debuts of these huge pop punk bands. I can't wait for that as well. So I think it's pretty cool that, so many journalists and authors are, writing about this stuff still to this day and are still interested in this. But yeah, for me, I always want it to be a book because reading's important. Reading's fun.
Reading's great.
Reading's great. But yeah, no, like I said, I like something tangible. And when I came up with the idea to make it a coffee table book, I reached out to Cassie Potash, who did the artwork, because I wanted to work with her years ago. I did a young adult fiction book, and I wanted her to do the cover. Things just didn't work out. But this, she was like perfect for. And, for those at home are unfamiliar, she's done stuff for Census Fail, Less Than Jake. God, so many, Seaway, who else?
I know she did one for Sum 41, I think.
Sum 41, she's done based almost any band you could really think of, any of the newer bands. She's done so much of their stuff, and she has such a distinct style and aesthetic to her. So when she came aboard to do the cover, I was like, well, let's do a little bit more. And it all kind of came together. And, I wanted to put in essential playlists and compilations and film guides. And I wanted to be kind of interactive so people can, just kind of pick it up, and then it'd be conversational too, Mm-hmm. So I wanted to tell the story, but I also had breaks in between, so that's why there's bonus content in the book. And, there's a day in the life of a tour manager when I shadowed my friend Jeff to see what that's like. So I really wanted to, incorporate, and then there's a testimonial section too, where I had people behind the scenes and people in the band write something about, a specific part of that era too. So I really wanted to incorporate a lot of different things to make it, like I said, something conversational and engaging and immersive.
I think that's interesting. Well, especially, I know we didn't want to bring it up, but because you are also a UFO journalist as well, you did have a book about punk rock and UFOs. So obviously you're melding it all together. And I think that's really interesting. Now, I have not read that book, but I am also very much into that personally. I don't know about Brian. That's on him. But I was like, well, this is really cool to kind of see these two worlds come together. So how exactly was that process in general? And then kind of navigating over to just saying here's some background info about pop punk and emo. Enjoy it.
So years ago, I wrote a book, Punk Rock and UFOs, and there's the first one, Cryptozoology Meets Anarchy, and it was basically about how these studies of cryptozoology and ufology were underdog sciences. And I wrote another one called True Believers. It's a Bouncing Souls reference, basically about the people who investigate this stuff and why it's important. And then Stranger Than Fiction, Bad Religion reference. That was the last one I came out with last year. And that's basically the encompasses all my UFO work, because it's something I've been interested in since I was a little kid. It was really fascinating to me. So Stranger Than Fiction, really, punk rock and UFO, Stranger Than Fiction, really kind of, the goal of that was to normalize paranormal using current events, comic book mythology, real life mythology, pop culture, religion, science, et cetera. And I really had a diverse group of people I interviewed for it and got quotes from. I got Tom Melange in the book. I got scientists. I got people who used to work for NASA. I got ex-military officials who witness stuff. I got people who work for Hollywood who make these films, as well as other UFO research. So that was basically, that's the idea of punk rock and UFOs. And my website is punkrockandufos.com, and I kind of continue doing UFO stories here and there when I can too.
I mean, now that everything is in the news and in the media, now it's like this big thing.
It's mainstream, just like when punk rock became mainstream.
Yeah. Should I be nervous? Should I be worried? Is something going to happen?
No.
I really feel like if UFOs were like Mars Attack UFOs, we'd be done by now. It would be already over. I really feel like that.
That's my fear. That's what I'm most afraid of.
I think it would have already happened. Hopefully. I think it would have already happened personally.
Okay. I've just been having, just because it's in the news, I've been having a lot more conversations about it lately. And now it's you start with the conversation where everybody says it's impossible that they don't exist. It's just, they have to exist. and then it's like having a conversation from that point. But then from that point now, the conversation is going in so many interesting places that I'm just like, wait, so what do we do now? Like, what am I supposed to know? And if we have, you know, an author, an expert, I'm like, should I be nervous? Should I be worried? Is there anything I need to do?
No, you're good.
All right. They don't want me.
Oh my God.
They're not looking for me. All right. Well, I mean, that's where we kind of wanted to, I guess, get at the end here. And now we're almost at an hour. So I want to make sure we have a chance to let you plug yourself, plug where everybody can find the book, find you on the internet, find more information about everything. And we'll keep talking for a little bit here and on Twitch afterwards. So I'll let you do that and we'll keep it going.
Yeah. So punkrockandufos.com. Yeah, that's where you can follow me. And my books are on there. I've written 5 books. Obviously, the newer one is Hey Suburbia. You know, like ultimately, the goal for this book was to, you know, serve 2 purposes. You know, I'm a big fan of nostalgia, so it's definitely a nostalgia-driven project, but also for people who are newer to the style of music to pick it up and kind of learn the history too. So it really is to serve kind of 2 groups of people. You know, older people like myself, and then younger people who are, you know, maybe their older brother, you know, or older sister got them into Fall Out Boy or something, and then they go back and, you know, learn a little bit more. So yeah, that was the goal of the book, and I'm hoping everyone's enjoying it so far. And yeah, thank you.
Absolutely.
Of course. I did see too, when the book came out, it sold pretty well on like Amazon, I think, right? It was like one of the #1 bestsellers.
Yeah, like it blew my mind. Like it was for a couple of days, it was #1 in a specific category, which is like music encyclopedias. I don't know if that's what number-wise that looks like. I'll probably have a better idea when I get royalties in 6 months. Sure. But I was really blown away by that. And like, there are people like who are involved in the book that helped out, like here or there, like, you know, some of them would like retweet it. But like, yeah, I just don't know what happened. I think that's a good thing. But I like, for example, Dylan Anderson, he used to run Atticus Clothing. He does Mark Hoppus's clothing line. He interviewed me for Mark Hoppus's website. So I think that was a big push, just having that on HiMyNameIsMark.com. That was really rad. And then just having a few other people maybe retweet it here and there. And who knows, maybe there's just an appetite for this style of music. And, you know, it's Alkaline Trio, pun intended. Maybe it's the right place at the right time.
I mean, so I know Blink is your favorite band, I'm assuming. And I mean, favorite bands for me always like kind of move around and shift and all that. So, you know, fair. And obviously now with, you know, Matt Skiba in or out or whatever, and we already kind of talked a little bit of like bring that back to Blink. Like, are we just mad at Blink now? Or are we just hating on Blink in all the new?
No. So the new stuff's pretty good. It's decent. And Alkaline Trio is my second favorite band. My first tattoo I ever got was an Alkaline Trio tattoo, and I'll defend Matt Skiba until the cows come home. He is the nicest person I've ever met or interviewed in music. I've interviewed him multiple times, met him multiple times. He is a legit nice dude, and he doesn't deserve any of the hate that's kind of thrown at him, you know, from some of like the Blink community. I will say this: if the people who don't like the Blink songs of Matt Skiba, they really need to go back and listen to Alkaline Trio's back catalog and say, hey, this guy's a really good songwriter. Because Matt Skiba is a really good songwriter, and he's a good dude. And if it wasn't for him, Blink wouldn't exist right now. So I was talking about this on another podcast today. It's like, you know, with him, God, they've done so much cool things, you know, in terms of touring and cool things at shows like meet and greets and, you know, just a lot of cool things that they've done with the Matt Skiba era. You know, like I said, they've toured constantly. They're putting out music, so it's a good time to be a fan of that band. And even Alkaline Trio, their last record they came out with really shocked me. The fact that on the side he just wrote this Alkaline, him and Dan wrote this Alkaline Trio record, and it was really good.
Yep.
As well. So I'm looking forward to seeing, you know, new music from, you know, both of those bands, you know, next year. I think Matt Skiba posted on Instagram this like demo he was doing on for Alkaline Trio, and it was like How We Used To. And it sounded amazing. I was like, oh, I hope this becomes an Alkaline Trio song. Go back and find it if you guys haven't heard it. It's on his Instagram page, and it just sounds like the perfect Alkaline Trio song.
I'll have to go check that. I'm a huge Alkaline Trio stan, so I'm always like surprised when we'll talk about Alkaline Trio. Like, Yeah, just, Alkaline Trio, they're one of these bands. They're huge. They're well loved. They're a big band in Chicago. They like headline Riot Fest all the time.
Yeah.
And then a bunch of people are just like, yeah, I haven't listened to them. And I'm like, what's going on? What's happening? I don't know how to do it.
There's so many people in this scene who are like, oh yeah, I never listened to them, or like, yeah, I heard them here and there. And it's just like, it blows my mind because for me, when I first heard them, it sounded like, Newfound Glory and Blink, but there was something deeper and darker to it, almost poetic. And I was like, man, these guys are doing something on a different level. Kind of like when Bad Religion came out, lyrically, Bad Religion was doing something on a different level. So yeah, I never got that, the fans are like, oh yeah, I love pop punk and emo, but I never got into Alkaline Trio. And I'm like, how?
Like, how did you get into Blink? Like, let's just say the Untitled era when they released Crimson and that. It's like, how did you get into Blink's Untitled? How did you get into AFI Sing the Sorrow, but you didn't get into Crimson? Like, how is that the one that flew under the radar?
I mean, as somebody who it flew over my head, it was
Lizzie,
just my friends. None of my friends in high school, even in undergraduate, none of them listened to Alkaline Trio. Like, I only started listening to Alkaline Trio when Brian and I started to like moreover just like work together, which was like what 3.5, 4 years ago.
Yeah.
And then I really love if this thing's cursed. And then I got into it. I'm like, oh, this is a really good band. But like none of my other friends, like literally when they did their 3-4 nights at Metro, I think Brian, you were just going, but I didn't want to like crash your party or whatever. But like I had no other friends I could go with if I wanted to, if I didn't want to go alone because I felt like weird about it. But like I had no friends who like have ever listened to Alkaline Trio, and still a lot of those friends have still never listened to Alkaline Trio. And like I'll talk to some of their older siblings I'm cool with. They're like, yeah, I kind of listen to them, but just not a lot. I'm like, this is so weird.
So that blows my mind. So the song my wife and I danced to at our wedding was "Every Thug Needs a Lady" acoustic.
Hell yes.
And I remember this is funny. So this was 2019, and then I think it was like that the next summer or whatever it was. Blink did their Enema of the State tour, and my wife's never met them, so we did like the meet and greet. And I was like, hey Matt, we danced Alkaline Trio's "Every Thug Needs a Lady" was our wedding song. And Mark Hoppus thought that was the coolest thing. He's like, Matt, did you hear that? Whoa, like that's so cool. Like he was like, oh, that was cooler than like Matt Skiba did. I thought that was funny.
Yeah. We're going to spread the gospel here about Alkaline Trio. So if you're listening to this podcast, you're watching us on Twitch, go listen to Alkaline Trio, get acquainted with all of it. And before you do that, make sure you go get the book, Hey Suburbia, from all of the best retailers, I guess, whichever retailer you use. Usually we say like Spotify and Apple Music for a band, but it's like, no, now you got to go to like Amazon.
No, put on Spotify in the background while you listen to Alkaline Trio, order the book, and then read the book with it playing in the back. It all comes together.
Perfect.
There's actually a Spotify playlist based on the playlist in the book too.
Perfect.
Oh, there we go.
Look it up and listen to the playlist while reading the book.
Yeah. We'll link that in the show notes of the pod, so you can check all that good stuff out. Go follow on all the social medias. Hey Suburbia, Mike Damante, all the places. Yeah. Thank you so much, Mike, for being on the podcast. This is actually
thanks, dude.
Really enlightening. I'm really glad to have your opinions on a lot of this stuff because I'm like, yeah, older people, we get it.
No, guys, thank you again. Like I said, I really like these opportunities to talk about this stuff. And anytime you guys want to have me back to talk about anything else, let me know. I'm down.
Absolutely.
Of course.